Now, before I go any further, there's one other thing that I want to talk about in terms of the role of the teacher with assessment. Picture, if you will, for me, a Venn diagram of two circles overlapping and interlinked. On one side, we have the objectivity, the data, what we can measure on the students, and we live in a teaching culture where that is remarkably prevalent, as no doubt you are aware. And as an accountable profession for a huge investment that the government makes of taxpayers' money, it's understandable that we need that objectivity in order to measure the job that we're doing as teachers. On the other side of the circle, however, I'd like you to imagine the subjectivity. Yeah, the fact that we know the students. You may have taught, you stay in one school long enough, you may have known that student for 7 years. You may have known them even longer if you've taught elder siblings. As a tutor and as a teacher, you know those students remarkably well in a way that the objectivity can't measure. It's a good point to make, that the objectivity of data is a snapshot. And if it's not a summative snapshot, it is data that is built upon professional judgment that comes from the subjectivity. Ourselves as tutors, we have to walk between the two circles of that Venn diagram. We can't let the data dominate to the exclusion of the subjectivity, nor would it be fair if the subjectivity was more important than the objectivity. It is that line down the middle. When it comes to assessing students, it is to know them the best that you can know them, to provide them with the best guidance that you can provide them, and then use your professional pedagogic skills to lead them to becoming better. So as we go through this entire activity, please remember we strive to walk that balancing act between the objectivity and the subjectivity and help assessment achieve that. Okay, so in this presentation we're going to discuss the 6 points that we've got here. What is assessment? Just exactly what is it? We all do it, we probably all do it differently. So what exactly is this common idea of what assessment is? How do we assess? And the different ways in which we are told to do it and how we might do it anyway. Why do we assess? When do we assess? How can our assessment improve? And how can we link assessment to what this presentation is meant to be about, to raising expectations and creating aspirations amongst our students? And I suppose essentially making sure that we educate them better than we were educated, so we have the next generation of teachers under our tutelage now who do a better job with our children than maybe we are with them. Okay, start off with two definitions of what assessment actually is. The first one here is from QCA. Assessment for learning. They don't give any other definition, which is really telling. Assessment for learning is the process, not a snapshot, a process of seeking and interpreting evidence for use by learners, principally them first, and then their teachers, to identify where learners are in their learning, assuming that it's an ongoing process, where they need to go to and how best to get there. I have no issues with that definition whatsoever. It's totally supportive of what the students are trying to do and how we can help them get there. And again, I stress the word help. I'm striving to walk that balance between the subjective and the objective. I will not entirely be held accountable to data, because the data has its limitations, but equally, I have to balance my subjective interpretation with reasonable expectations that the data would suggest. And finally, to go all pretentious again, the extract from Merriam-Webster's dictionary. The etymology of the word assessment comes from assessus, apparently, the Latin, to sit beside. And I think that's a wonderful image of what we have to do. Unfortunately, we have to often do it with classes of 30 and can't sit beside all of them. But that idea of the pupil and the teacher, this journey that both take, where one guides the other, doesn't lead them, guides them. The teacher's destination and the pupil's, well, we've already said at the beginning, looking at Yeats, is that quite possibly the dream of the student is to be something that the teacher has no knowledge of, but to sit beside and imbue the skills and the abilities in the student to become whatever their dreams want them to be. So how do we assess? And there are a lot of ways that we do this. We assess after the event more often than not. Very rarely do we do it during. And as it says here, quite a long time after the learning event has taken place. I don't know if you have a cycle for marking books, it might be fortnightly, in which case 2 weeks. If you're disciplined, and I can't say I'm the most disciplined marker in the world, it could be considerably longer. We can assess formatively, informatively, to give the students information. The what went well, even better if, that we talk about in school, is that formative, informing the students of where they are, what they need to do, and how they're going about getting there. The QCA definition that we talked about previously. Summative assessment, the wonderful assessment that I experienced as a student at school. You are not as good as those people ahead of you, and you're considerably better than those people down there. And of course, like all good education was 10, 15, 20 years ago, you'd probably be lined up to show that. Somehow the belief that humiliation can in fact be some kind of motivational tool. Summative assessment has its purposes, has its place. Quick tests, not too sure about them, to be honest, but then again I've got to be careful here because of course summative assessment is what we call GCSEs, A-levels, degrees. So summative assessment is firmly established in our profession, rightly or wrongly. Assessment for learning, the big drive that we've had in recent years, assessment for learning, empowering the students to learn for themselves, to set their own targets, to reflect on previous work. It's what assessment should be, a part of the process of learning. We also assess by marking books, or those ticks that we put across pages. Apparently that's assessment. I don't know if it's assuaging your guilt that you haven't looked at their books often enough, or some kind of process whereby the students think they are being checked up on and the parents think that their tax money is being spent well. Not too sure on that one, but marking books is obviously one of the principal ways in which we assess students' work. Peer assessment and self-assessment, different ways that we assess. In my role as an AST and as a teacher, peer assessment's never been voted up there on the top 10 of pupil favourite pastimes. They all too often think it's some kind of cop-out on the part of the teacher. Yet it does, if done well, have a very powerful role to play. But of course, there is often a fundamental role of trust between you and the pupil who is having their work marked. One has to tread carefully to make sure that that trust is there between the peer markers when they're marking each other's work. If planned and delivered well and thought through, it can be a powerful tool. The last one, however, is one that I think we don't give enough credence to, but fundamentally is the one that directs the rest. It's the informal assessments that we do. When we talked earlier about the objective and the subjective, it is the subjective. It's the 1,000,001 interactions you have with students every single day of the year. It's the process of the conversations, the clubs, the trips that you go on, getting to know the students, identifying the idiosyncrasies that make them who they are. All of those things that give you that, well, we can't measure it, which makes it a problem, but that gut instinct about that pupil. And I, for one, when I'm talking to parents, I will always start with the informal. I will always start with the subjective. Not to ignore the objective, the data, but this is a human profession. Let's start with the informal. So why do we assess? wonderfully put here. Its purpose is not really to judge the learning, but to describe it, to make it visible. I think it's a very, very powerful phrase. It's a qualitative measure, often using comments and descriptions to support the learner. But in that very expression here, to support the learner, it implies a relationship, a dialogue between you, the teacher, and the student. Without it, all assessment is proof that you are literate, you understand what the students have done, and you can write in red ink. When you think about identifying the spelling mistakes that a student has made in their work, unless the student interacts with the feedback that you've given and corrects their spellings, all you've proven is you're literate and they are not. A wonderful presentation I saw once regarding assessment and assessment for learning was where a lecturer had presented on one side of a diagram all the assessment responsibilities that a teacher had with a class, and on the other side of the diagram all the responsibilities the pupil had. And what this lecturer suggested was basically you swap them over. Now he said maybe that's a little bit extreme, but somewhere in the middle is that dialogue that you need to establish. You can support the learner, but the learner has to be proactive in the process. Assessment for their learning. Their learning. You're the teacher. They are the learner. Don't do the learning for them. Hold their hand, sit by them, but at some point down the line you have to let go. And finally at the bottom, to establish that dialogue between a teacher and learner. A dialogue. One size does not fit all. And dwell on that, because that very much falls into this subjective nature of what assessment is. The data that we have is far too often one size fits all, and we judge everyone by everyone else, the top 25%, the top quartile, all of this data terminology. Strike the balance between the objective and the subjective. And the last point, very interesting, especially when one has Ofsted coming in, or a classroom observation, or a parents' evening, where the mark book, the Bible, is put out as some kind of authoritative text that you use, and you talk like God in the Old Testament, smiting people with it. Do you just do assessments? Do fill out your mark book? I've seen some teachers in awe of other teachers because their mark book is full and it's wonderfully set out. Does it tell you any more? Does it compensate for not knowing the pupils as individuals? Again, strike the balance between the two. When do we assess? When it is appropriate and beneficial to the learner and the teacher. You would struggle to be an effective teacher today and someone who can balance their personal and professional life without looking at the school calendar. There are peaks and troughs of when our workload is beyond managing and manageable. There's no point setting an assessment if you can't turn that assessment around quickly with informed marking that establishes a dialogue and that is planned for. That is, in history, a pre-assessment so the students know exactly what they're going to be asked to do. The assessment proper. The opportunity to mark the assessment and provide feedback, and followed up with the ability to establish a dialogue between the assessment you have done and what they're going to do with it. Now therefore, every assessment that we do in history, and of course the school rules, we have to do one formal assessment every half term. That's 4 lessons. It has to be planned for. Therefore, it has to be appropriate. It has to be beneficial for both the learner and the teacher. It has to be planned for. The informal assessment, they go on all the time as part of being human. The formal assessments have to be planned for. So how can we improve what we do in terms of assessment? We're asking the students to be assessed in order to learn. Assessment for learning. We as teachers need to model that ourselves. And it's incredibly empowering for them, for you to have that conversation with them. How could I be a better teacher? You learn, students learn. How could I be a better teacher to help you learn? Try the conversation. Remarkably enlightening. Okay. Now, in history, I'm hoping this link works. In history, we plan for it. Okay, here we go. Here we go. All the way through. We said on the previous slide that you can only assess when it's appropriate. Therefore, you have to plan for it. You can do your ad hoc assessments, got no problem with that. But to do it properly, and of course across a subject taught by many colleagues, you have to have commonality. So it has to be planned for. So everything that we do in the subject, all the themes that we have to cover, are planned for. Hopefully in the room that you're sat in now, you can look around and you can see up on the wall that the students can see what lesson they're being taught in which order. You can see that the students know what the skills are and what the colours all mean. It's transparent. There's a purpose behind the assessment. The students will know when the assessment will be. They know the language that we will be using in order to make assessment manageable, to make it informative, and to establish a dialogue. It's by no means perfect. So we have the student voice constantly asking the students, how can we get this better? How can we improve what we are doing for you? Do you know in your subject just exactly what you are expected to assess them on? Because certainly in our school, beyond your own discipline, you probably are largely ignorant of what's going on. You are the subject specialist in your own area. Do you know in geography specifically what the skills are? In music? In English? Okay. Research indicates that improving learning through assessment depends upon 5 deceptively simple key factors. Probably all too easily forgotten amongst the plethora of things that we're asked to do. Active involvement. Assessment is something that they are involved in. It's not what you do. Assessment for learning. They are the learners, not you. Other than you striving to model that you always want to be better. They are the learners. They have to be actively involved. Summative assessment, just throwing a number at them or a grade at them, doesn't do that. Unless you get them actively involved. Using that to motivate and raise the self-esteem of pupils. Therefore, no surprise that the school model is what went well. And you would struggle not to find merits in any piece of work that a student has genuinely tried at. What went well, then the even better if. And finally, to establish a culture where the students can assess themselves, their own progress, and get them fluent in the language of how they can improve themselves. That's the dream. That's the dream there of assessment for learning. It's what we need to strive to do, what we need to strive to do. And you can't do it just in a department. You can't do it as a sole subject teacher. You can't do it in a department. You can't do it in a faculty. It has to be a whole school culture. Therefore, the commonality of approach, what went well, even better if. One formally marked piece of work every single half term, the data collection, the collation that's undertaken routinely for every teacher, in every subject, for every pupil. And the characteristics of assessment that promote learning. There's some basics in here: the sharing of learning goals, learning objectives, and learning outcomes. We teach them some very, very obscure stuff in all of our subjects. You sit back and you think, when I was at school, they taught me in chemistry about balancing chemical equations. I can't say there's been a day gone by when I haven't dwelt on what I learned in those lessons. Some very obscure poetry in English. Shakespeare never really grasped that, to be honest. In maths, algebra, well, I've yet, now looking back, I've yet to find a practical use for algebra in the real world. If you can't justify why you're doing what you're doing with the students, don't they have the right to question it? In history, I teach them about dead people. Doesn't sound like a particularly healthy profession unless I go to the trouble of explaining why what we are teaching them is relevant. Sometimes history teaches itself some great stories. I suppose that's the argument for Shakespeare, thinking about it. Some great stories in history. And if they can't click to that, well, that's embedded within the lesson. There are skills unique to my subject. They're on the ceiling in my classroom. They're colour-coded on the wall in the schemes of learning that the pupils see. Or even if they don't buy into that, then there are the pelts, the personal learning and thinking skills that should be embedded across the school. Be the child an effective participator, a team learner, a creative thinker. Share the learning goals. I dare you to challenge your students. If I don't explain why we're doing this and what the purpose is of this lesson, you have every right to ask me why I'm doing it. Very empowering thing for the students. Help the pupils to know what it is they're striving to achieve. Model the best practice. Show them exemplar work. Have those resources online so they can find out at any time what exactly it is they are trying to do. Pupils are involved in the self-assessment. You don't do it to them, and that's it. They do the work. You mark it. You feed back. They feed back to you. Keep it going. Which then leads to the pupils recognizing their strengths and their weaknesses. It'd be great if the students could actually identify what went well, and even better if in their own work. It goes back to the lecture of you taking the teacher's responsibilities and shifting it over to those of the students. It involves both teacher and pupils reviewing and reflecting on assessment data. SIMS is there not just to empower you, it's there for you to share that information. And it's not just SIMS, is it? It's what you have in your own mark book, it's your own departmental tracking and assessment policies. They are there as tools to help students better themselves. Well, as we near the end of this then, how can assessment link to expectation and target setting? You have to know the student. We're back with the Venn diagram of the subjective and the objective. You have to know them. Your job is that of a teacher. The day those students sat in front of you become the numbers they are on SIMS is the day the teaching profession, as I know it, and I hopefully believe the one you joined, is at an end. You have to know them, and you have to reconcile the person you know with the data that we have. When is the data accurate? When is the data wrong? Don't let the data become more important than the student. But don't ignore the data, because it can be remarkably insightful. We are data rich, be it through SIMS or be it through our own tracking. We've got to turn data rich into information rich. We've got to be able to use it to help the students, to inform our teaching, to personalise our teaching, to raise the standards. It's not a stick, nor is it a carrot. Again, it's somewhere in that overlap between the two circles of the Venn diagram of our role, our objectivity, our subjectivity. So at the end of this now, hopefully you have some idea of those 6 questions that we set at the start. What is assessment? How do we assess? Why do we assess? When? How can our assessment improve? And how can our assessment link to expectation and target setting? I hope this has been of some help, but I imagine it's probably generating more questions than it's answered. But then again, assessment for learning is a process, probably without an end. So I hope it's been of help.